Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2019 Georgia Writers Hall of Fame induction ceremony. I'm Toby Graham, University Librarian and Associate Provost, and tonight we gather to celebrate the lives and the works of A.E. Stallings, Jhansi Edges, and posthumously of Julia Collier Harris. They're among the 68 writers inducted since the University of Georgia established the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2000. The Hargrett Library, which administers the Hall of Fame, holds the most extensive collection of works written by Georgians and about Georgia, and the papers of many of our state's key literary figures. I need to express our deep gratitude to the late George Montgomery and to Nancy Montgomery, whose love of literature and philanthropic spirit led them to create a Georgia Writers Hall of Fame endowment to ensure that we're able to recognize the literary talent of Georgians for generations to come. I welcome all of our previously installed Georgia Writers Hall of Fame inductees. And I believe tonight we have with us Jim Cobb. Jim, where are you? Please stand and let us recognize you. And Cynthia Shearer. Cynthia. Philip Lee Williams. Where are you, Phil? Judson Mitchum. Judson. No, Janice Ray was with us last night. I don't believe she's here this evening. Are there any others that I just missed coming in? Okay. I want to note that we've had Charles Davis with us, who's the Dean of the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication. Charles, are you still with us in the room? He joined us for the last event. And certainly the family and friends of our inductees, and in particular Penny Hart, Linda Harris, and Annette Shakespeare, who are representing Julia Collier Harris. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame relies on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted. And I'm going to take just a moment to recognize the judges who are with us tonight. Now, our authors, our inductees, are also judges. Either they are currently or they have served as judges in the past. So I'll mention those of us who have not been inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. So Lisa Baer. Lisa Baer is the director of the University of Georgia Press. Thank you, Lisa. Valerie Boyd. Please stand and let us recognize you, Valerie. Valerie is the Charlene Hunter Galt Distinguished Writer in Residence at the Grady College of Journalism and Associate Professor. Peggy Gallus. Peggy, from right here in Athens, Georgia. Sheffield Hale. Sheffield. She's the CEO of the Atlanta History Center. Julie Hunt. Julie, thank you. From Tifton, Georgia. And John Insko. I saw him shortly ago. He's the Albert B. Say Professor of History at UGA. Shell Knox from Augusta. And introducing this gentleman for the first time as a judge, Dr. Gerald Ma. Gerald is our new editor of the Georgia Review. Welcome to the Board of Judges, Gerald. Dr. Hugh Ruppersberg. And Hugh is the Emeritus University Professor of English and Senior Associate Dean at UGA. Kat Stein. Kat is in the back there. She is the Director of the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And we also have with us Neely Young. Neely? Neely is the Emeritus Publisher and Editor-in-Chief of Georgia Trend magazine. And finally, a warm welcome and thank you to the individuals who will introduce and induct this year's recipients. Valerie Boyd, who we introduced previously, the Charlene Hunter Galt Distinguished Writer in Residence. Janice Hume. Janice, you can rise and let us say hello to you. The Carolyn McKenzie and Donnie Carter Chair for Excellence in Journalism and professor and department head in journalism. And then welcoming to UGA, Chelsea Rathburn, Poet Laureate of the state of Georgia. So with that, let's begin.
Jhansi Edges Bio tells you much of what you need to know about him. That he writes about the American South, that he is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, and that he has won 3 James Beard Awards, including the 2012 MFK Fisher Distinguished Writing Award. It tells you that his latest book, The Pot Liquor Papers, A Food History of the Modern South, was named a Best Book of 2017 by NPR, Publishers Weekly, and a host of others. That Nashville chose The Pot Liquor Papers as a citywide read for 2018. His bio also tells you that he's now writer and host for the television show True South, which airs on the SEC network, and that his day job is serving as director of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, where he documents, studies, and explores the diverse food cultures of the American South. That's a lot, but Jhansi's bio doesn't tell you everything. While it hints at his great appetite for good food, it doesn't tell you about his huge appetite and capacity for friendship, for fellowship, for fairness. It doesn't tell you about his intellectual curiosity, which can make him boyishly giddy when learning something new, whether a cool new app or a disquieting truth about the world in which we live. His bio also doesn't tell you about his kind-heartedness and his uncommon generosity with students, friends, and colleagues. When I invited Jhansi Edge to join me as one of the inaugural faculty members of the UGA MFA program in narrative nonfiction at the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, he said an immediate yes. He did not hesitate. He later told me that he wishes he had played it a little cooler, that he should have acted harder to get rather than so eager and enthusiastic. But Jhansi's enthusiasm is infectious, and along with his snort laugh, I count it as one of his most endearing qualities. Just as he was quick to say yes to my invitation to teach at UGA, Jhansi does not hesitate to take a quick call from a graduate student who needs to talk through their vision for a story. He does not hesitate when a student or a friend or a colleague has lost their way for a moment and needs someone to grip them by the shoulders and tell them it's going to be all right. Jhansi does not hesitate to center the contributions of working-class Black women in his writing, as he does in the Pot Liquor Papers. He does not hesitate when he's called out on his privilege as a white male writer. Instead, he will sit for hours to have the difficult conversation, for however long it takes, with an open mind that leads to an open exchange toward an open road of understanding. Jhansi does not hesitate. Instead, he finds a way to share the mic, to amplify the voices of those who might otherwise be pushed to the margins. In his books, magazine pieces, and now his TV show, we see ample evidence of Jhansi Edges' capacious appetite for story, for truth-telling, for making room at the welcome table for all kinds of food, and for eaters and thinkers of all colors and cultures. Jhansi does not hesitate. And so when I was asked to introduce him for this latest honor as an inductee into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, I did not hesitate. I am honored to share this well-deserved day with my colleague and friend, Jhansi Edge.
I already cry pretty easily. You made it far easier. Thank you, Valerie. It's humbling. And thank y'all. There's so many people to thank, and It's a duty I take seriously. I think Toby Graham and I think Leandra Nassau, who I spoke of so warmly last night, meant every bit of it. I thank the staff and faculty here at the Richard B. Russell Special Collections for the warm welcome both this weekend and also when our MFA cohort gathers here. I thank the Board of Judges and the fellow writers assembled in this room whose work I respect so much and am so honored to be considered in your company. I thank my great friend Peggy Gallus and Judy Long, whom I had the pleasure of shouting out their names last night, and I want to shout them out again. So many people who welcomed me back to this city after I left this place. This is styled as remarks. That's what I was asked to give, and I thought about the work that Valerie and I do here together, and I think the work that Janice stewards here and Charles Davis stewards here. And so I wrote a narrative response to this. I wrote 6 scenes from my life here in Georgia that are an attempt for me to make sense of my relationship to this place. So I hope you'll indulge me as I try to spin a quick narrative. It was a writing exercise, and I've been working with students all weekend on the phone, and I was like, I need to subject myself to a writing exercise. So these are 6 quick scenes, and then there's a poem, and then there's a coda. And don't worry, I didn't write the poem. The year is 1948. Atlanta is the place. Mary Beverly Evans marries John Thomas Edge. They rent an apartment on Roswell Road in the same building where Gates City Manufacturing once mass-produced a mail-order catalog selling Grand Cyclops capes and Kliegel robes. My mother, who always believed in ghosts, would tell me years later that their apartment was haunted. I would realize years after that the whole state seemed haunted. The year is 1962. My parents have moved from Atlanta to Clinton. I am born in the middle of a 4-year celebration of the Civil War centennial in the home of Confederate Brigadier General Alfred Iverson Jr., a home purchased for him by his father, Alfred Iverson, who helped lead the secession of Georgia from the Union, and who declared from the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1861, "You may whip us, but we will not stay whipped. We will rise again and again to vindicate our right to liberty and throw off your oppressive and accursed yoke, and never cease the moral strife until our whole white race is extinguished and our fair land given over to desolation. The South will rise again." The year is 1971, my 3rd year in grade school. Jones County integrated its public schools last year. This is my 1st year in private school in nearby Macon. My new school is just a couple of blocks from the College Street Flophouse that the Allman Brothers Band first called home in Macon. This is the year that Dwayne Allman dies in a motorcycle crash. This is the year I remember standing on the playground at my new school, my fingers hooked in a chain link fence, watching the motorcycles that roar by in the afternoon, trailing patchouli and petroleum and change. The year is 1982. In my 3rd fitful year of college, my ear for my region begins to shift. After REM releases its first EP, Chronic Town, my understanding of the South begins to shift too. Rock is art, REM and Love Tractor and Pylon make clear. About the same time I start listening to them, I see a Jason and the Nashville Scorchers show at Legion Field. They play an Athens double bill with the Psychedelic Furs. When Jason Ringenberger rips apart the Hank Williams song, "I Saw the Light," and leaps off the stage into the audience, I hear the traditional South recast, torn apart and put back together. Much later, as I began to think and write about the South, I recognized that art might be something I can attempt, and change might be something I can help drive. The year is 1992. I win my first real job in Atlanta. I sell a data stream of analysis to credit managers and risk analysis traders. For a small town Georgia boy, Atlanta is my city on a hill. I aim to be a citizen of the world. At dim sum houses and strip mall sushi restaurants, I become a regular. Over steamed bao stuffed with roasted pork and maguro nigiri and toro nigiri, I watch and listen and imagine a different kind of life. As a boy, my mother encouraged me to be different. She wanted me to stand up and stand out. At 32, I quit my job. I aimed to make good on her wish and on my promise. Years will pass before I recognize that's what I'm doing. Before I recognize what I'm doing is trying to reconcile with the place that made me. The year is 1997. I moved to Oxford 2 years ago to finish up my undergraduate degree and begin graduate studies in Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. Casting about for a thesis to write, I read through the archives of Julian Harris. Yes, that Julian Harris. An editor at the Atlanta Constitution, husband of the posthumous inductee Julia Collier Harris. I'm inspired by what I discover in those archives. Letters, correspondence from 1931. When Julian Harris challenged Huey Long to a debate about the relative merits of dunking or crumbling cornbread into pot liquor. A debate that revealed truths about Southern attitudes on race, class, gender, ethnicity, identity. Over 600 letters to the editor. I write my master's thesis on pot liquor and corn pone. That graduate work serves as a prompt for the book I eventually write, a food history of the modern South called the Pot Liquor Papers. Writing my master's thesis, among the hundreds of articles and letters to the editor, I discover a poem written by an Atlanta church elder, published in the Constitution. I will read it now in tribute to the family of our posthumous honoree and with apologies to my fellow honoree, A.E. Stallings. Ode to a Crumbled Pone. I've eaten many luscious fruits. I've tasted many sweets. I've been in many hot disputes about the choicest eats. I've dined on tongue of nightingale. At Manus I'm some picker. But how I wish I were a whale facing corn pone and pot liquor. Hog and hominy are hard to head. Rabbit roast is fair. Country ham with gravy red is in the race for fare. I like rich, juicy chicken pie with dumplings rich and slicker. But bless your heart, this gets my eye, crumbled corn pone and pot liquor. And now a coda. Some people make up for lost time. After I dropped out of the University of Georgia, I made up for lost degrees. I found my way. I wrote a book. Inspired by those ghosts my mother spied on Roswell Road, and by Huey Long and by Julian Harris. I stand outside this state now. As I age, I dig back into the place that made me. I forever return to Georgia, if not physically, then emotionally and creatively. My writing is a reckoning with a region in its misdeeds and its magnificence. With my complicity, with my beliefs, with my hopes. With burdens that weigh heavy, Georgia is where my narrative began. It's where my story gained shape and meaning. And I'm deeply honored that y'all find value in what I attempt. And I thank you.
Greetings from the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. My name is Janice Hume, and I am delighted to introduce Julia Collier Harris, journalist and author, as the 2019 inductee into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Every year, the Grady College holds a symposium to celebrate journalistic courage. We want our students to meet journalists who risk their lives, their fortunes, and their reputation in the pursuit of truth. If Julia Collier Harris were alive today, she would headline any discussion about journalistic integrity and bravery. In partnership with her husband, Julia led the Columbus Inquirer-Sun to a 1926 Pulitzer Prize for service rendered, quote, in its brave and energetic fight against the Ku Klux Klan, against the enactment of a law barring the teaching of evolution, against dishonest and incompetent public officials, and for justice to the Negro and against lynching. Civil rights historian Cully Clark notes the Harrises did remarkable progressive journalism, but didn't win any new friends or business in the process. They lost their newspaper, refused to declare bankruptcy, and spent 20 years repaying their debts. But let's go back to the beginning. Julia Collier was an Atlanta girl born in 1875 to former Mayor Charles Collier and his wife Susan. She graduated from Washington Seminary in Atlanta and attended finishing school and an art school in Boston until she returned home to manage her father's household and her many siblings following her mother's death. She married Julian, son of writer Joel Chandler Harris, in 1897. The couple had 2 sons, both of whom died in childhood. The Harrises threw themselves into their work as journalists. Julia wrote about literature and arts for the Atlanta Constitution, and when Julian was named Sunday editor for the New York Herald, Julia wrote for the Herald Syndicate under the pseudonym Constance Bine. She was one of 2 women to cover the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Despite their adventures in New York and Paris, the Harrises missed Georgia. So in 1920, they bought the Columbus Inquirer-Sun. They came home and used their newspaper to crusade for social progress for nearly a decade. They weren't afraid to take on a fight. They battled the Klan, publishing the names of its members. They wrote editorials against lynching, the convict lease system, and all manner of racial injustice. They fought against corrupt public officials who stood in the way of educational reform. Julia was outraged when a bill was introduced in the Georgia legislature to ban teaching or sanctioning in any public forum or school any theory which held that men evolved from a lower animal. Julia believed that banning the teaching of evolution in Georgia schools would seriously damage the state's education system. She wrote articles explaining the theory of evolution, and Julian penned protest editorials against the law. It did not pass. When the famous Scopes monkey trial began in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, the Harrises borrowed money to get there to cover the story. Not just the spectacle, but the trial's implications for education and the dangers of rampant fundamentalism. Julia wrote features about the issues and the trial. Fundamentalism of every kind is spreading its flamboyant banners, she wrote, and flamboyancy is an easy winner of uninformed minds. When the Harrises sold their newspaper in 1929, they moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the Chattanooga Times. But they ended up back in Atlanta, where Julian became Southern correspondent for the New York Times. Julia's talent as a writer extended well beyond the newsroom. Her first book was a translation of Romanian folk tales. She wrote a biography of her famous father-in-law, The Life and Letters of Joel Chandler Harris, which the New York Times praised as a record in which filial affiliation never obscured the main object, to show the man as he was and all the relations of his life and his art. She later edited a collection of her father-in-law's journalistic work and essays. Julia Chandler Harris was a woman who believed in a better South and in the power of journalism. She was an active member in the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. She supported students and faculty here at UGA in their fight for free speech and academic freedom under pressure from external political forces. She mentored young journalists up until her death in 1967. I wish she were here today to inspire our journalism majors with her courage and her work for social justice. Julia Collier Harris is certainly a worthy new member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. It is my great honor to share just a small part of her story with you.
Hello, everybody. I am not used to this kind of thing, and it's terrible to follow all this interesting stuff that's already transpired. But I wanted to thank this group on behalf of some wonderful members of the Harris family over there and all the members of the Collier family, which I represent, for highlighting this remarkable woman of whom we are very, very proud. I'm lucky enough and old enough to have sat at the feet of Julia and Julian Harris many times as a little girl with pigtails. And what was just said about her mentoring young people, she did that in outrageous generosity, even when you didn't deserve it. I would bring her little childish colorings that I had made, and the next time I came back, they were in gilded frames on the living room wall. And I'm telling you, that makes a profound impression on a child. Anyway, I'm happy that this group is continuing telling the story of Julia Collier Harris. There's an old saying that a person never really dies until people, no longer tell their story. And thank heavens, Historic Oakland Cemetery tells Julia's story all the time. So does the Wren's Nest, the House Museum of Joel Chandler Harris. The Georgia Women of Achievement take her story around on their storyboards, and now you all have done the same. And we really appreciated it in this time where it's very rare for someone to stand up and tell the truth when they do so at their own peril. It's very important to remember people like this who did that. And I'm proud to be her great niece. Thank you.
I met Alicia Stallings at the Westchester Poetry Conference in 2000, not long after her first book, the Richard Wilbur Award-winning Archaic Smile, had been published. We were participants in the same workshop, on the sonnet, and the workshop leader privately told me that he thought Alicia should be teaching, not taking the class. When I read Archaic Smile, I agreed. A citizen of Athens, Greece, by way of Athens, Georgia, where she'd studied classics at UGA after growing up in Decatur, Alicia offered fresh takes on Greek myths, issuing corrections and retellings in the voices of Persephone, Penelope, and others, as well as complex poems about modern life, all told in perfectly wrought, intricate rhymes. I read and reread Archaic Smile, studying its forms and marveling at how Alicia made it all look so easy. Since publishing her debut collection in 1999, Alicia's reputation has only grown with each new book, from 2006's Hapax, recipient of the Poets Prize, to 2012's Olives, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her most recent collection, Like, was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. Alicia has also published translations of The Nature of Things by Lucretius and Works and Days by Hesiod, and she's been recognized by prestigious fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. She also was quickly invited back to the conference where we met, but this time as a workshop leader, and she's taught on the faculty of the Swanee and Breadloaf Writers Conferences. I think what critics and readers alike respond to in her poems are the marvelous marriages of wit and warmth, of contemporary and classical sensibilities, and of music and meaning. There's a misconception sometimes that both the classics and poetry and traditional forms are somehow no longer relevant, that they can't adequately address the modern experience. Again and again, Alicia has proved this wrong. With what Alicia's called the strange dream logic connections of the rhymes themselves that lead a poem forward, her poems perpetually delight and surprise. In conversation with the past and the present, Alicia's poems slyly slide from humor to anguish, from the domestic to the universal, and back again, capturing the frustrations and joys faced by mothers, husbands and wives, and citizens and exiles. In recent years, Alicia has been demonstrating what it means to be a citizen of the world through her involvement in the refugee crisis in Greece. She has not only been addressing the situation in devastating poems like Empathy and Refugee Fugue, but volunteering on the front lines and leading poetry workshops for women refugees. As Alicia refuses to turn away from the crisis on her doorstep, choosing to engage with rather than withdraw from the world, I believe her poetry and her example as a poet and humanitarian will become even more essential to us all.
Thank you. I might need my water, actually. My voice isn't so great. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Chelsea, for those wonderful remarks. Chelsea is the poet laureate of Georgia, and I'm really delighted that she was able to come and to make those remarks. Thank you to Toby and Leandra and to the Board of Judges. I'm also very moved today that I have so many people from different parts of my life who are here celebrating. I have former roommates and former hallmates and former bandmates and former department heads and professors. My family is here. My mother, Alicia Stallings, and my sister, Jocelyn. This is, I think it's common to say that one is humbled at these things, and that's not exactly how I feel. I feel very affirmed, and I feel also that the faith all of these people have had in me from the beginning is also affirmed, and I hope that they share in this prize with me. I'm going to make some remarks, and then I'm going to read a poem. I have been translating the poet Hesiod. He's basically the same era as Homer. He might even be the older poet. The ancients thought he was the older poet. But you know how we don't know anything about Homer? Is he, she, or they, maybe even they in its current sense? We don't know, and it doesn't matter because he's writing these sublime epics. But Hesiod is the first poet, might be 8th century BC, who gives us a bio of himself. And he includes in it that he's won a major award. So, which he then takes back to his hometown. And there is, I think, nothing more special than to be honored in your alma mater. That is a very special feeling. I'm going to read some remarks a little bit about what Athens, Georgia was like when I was here. As a friend, these glasses get tangled in my hair. As a friend of mine used to say, the reason you went to the University of Georgia in the 80s and 90s was to flunk out of the art school and found REM. Athens, Georgia was at the time the hippest town on the planet. It had all the self-referential intensity and self-regard of its namesake in the 5th century BC. If, say, for philosophy, architecture, and the flowering of democracy, you substituted hipness and college radio. Downtown was the omphalos of that hipness. There is a bookstore in Prague called The Globe. It is not named after the theater of Shakespeare, but after a bar in downtown Athens. This is true. Radiating out, you would encounter the neoclassicism of North Campus, and then the rundown Victorian gingerbread houses, now not so rundown, I notice, cut up into student apartments, and the antebellum mansions come frat houses, then 1970s housing projects and cement dorms, sans air conditioning in those days. And somewhere in the infinite distance, South Campus, where ag majors bided their time before returning to various Georgia hamlets and family farms. Don't go back to Rockville. Beyond the endless fields of the ag school lay Oconee, still a dry county. See the B-52 songs, all those decades after the repeal of Prohibition. Fresh out of high school, I was a geek of the highest order. From Atlanta, that shopping strip carpetbagger town to the west. I played violin in the school orchestra, had written but not published a fantasy novel that involved little people who rode battle rabbits. Hung out with a group who spoke in Monty Python and never attended a single high school dance. When on the bus to driver's ed, a guy asked me what music I listened to. I knew I didn't have the right answer. Mahler, I confess. But it turned out that the golden key to the Wonderland Garden of Hipness was in fact my orchestra geekness. There was some demand for people who could actually play an instrument. Downtown was covered in neon flyers for those seeking their ideal bandmates. The listing of an ingenious amalgam of influences was paramount, often ending with the stern caveat, no posers. The first band I was in fact, involved a tortured soul, an aspiring songwriter who had just purchased his first guitar. We practiced in the bassist's double-wide trailer. He was a real grown-up and more country than rock and roll, down the Atlanta highway past the Pepsi bottling plant and a place that specialized in barbecued goat. The first half hour of practice involved Craig's trying to tune his guitar until the bassist couldn't bear it anymore and grabbed it off him. We never played out or had a gig, but hauling my violin to band practice was a lot cooler than going to orchestra. And just to say that this is, I think, very intertwined indeed with my sense of poetry was at the same time. And the idea of reading out, having a poetry reading. My first reading was at the Downstairs, which is now, I think, a bourbon tasting establishment. And my department head, Rick LaFleur, was there. But this idea that poetry was performance like music. On Tuesday nights, we went to see Widespread Panic at the Uptown Lounge. We enjoyed the music, but the real draw was the 75-cent Rolling Rocks and a lenient carding policy. When perusing bands that played around town at the 40 Watt or the Uptown Lounge, dorm mates would circle the names of bands we had never heard of. Rumors ran wild, for it was known that REM sometimes did surprise gigs at local clubs under assumed names. Most of the time, though, if you went out to see an unknown band called Beast Penis, it would end up being Beast Penis. For my last gig with the band I did end up playing with George Burnley Vest, who is a genius songwriter, at the Downstairs, where I also held my first poetry reading. Vest decided to make a rockumentary, Attack the Downstairs, or a mockumentary maybe, of our band. One of the more telling moments in the back-to-back interviews with the drummer and me, where it is clear to the camera, but unbeknownst to ourselves, that we are at cross purposes and on the verge of breaking up. Couples break up, bands break up. Everything is always hurtling apart in this expanding universe of ours. Every few years, that much older and wiser and farther away from my zenith of hipness, I sit here in the distant future and take out the tape and watch it. What shiny, happy people we were. That is to say, not how hip, but how lovely, how impossibly young. And I'm going to end on an early poem. So the family member who I would love to be here, and I hope in some sense is here, but who died in 2000 as my father. My family has always been very supportive of my writing. My mother was a school librarian, and I grew up always with the sense that books were written by people. And everyone in my family has always been supportive. My sister, my father. My father was a professor at Georgia State University. He would take me out of high school classes if there was a famous writer in town who was speaking during the school day. He would just sign me out. He's like, "You're going to see Stephen Spender," or Eudora Welty, or whoever was speaking at Agnes Scott or wherever that is. And I think also this is a sonnet, which is what I do. And it's a very Georgia sonnet, I think. And it's called Fishing. So I'd like to dedicate this award to my dad. Fishing. The two of them stood in the middle water, the current slipping away, quick and cold, the sun slow at his zenith, sweating gold, once in some sullen summer of father and daughter. Maybe he regretted he had brought her. She'd rather have been elsewhere, her look told, perhaps a year ago, but now too old. Still, she remembered lessons he had taught her, to cast towards shadows where the sunlight fails and fishes shelter in the undergrowth, and when the unseen strikes, how all else pales beside the bright, dark struggle, the rainbow wroth, life and death weighed in the shining scales, the invisible line pulled taut that links them both. Thank you.
That was wonderful, and it's been a very special weekend. And so, just before I close, I do want to thank some of the folks who helped to make this weekend possible. In large part, our staff, including Leandra Nessel, who's been mentioned. Leandra, can you stand up and let us give you a round of applause? And also from the Hargrett Library, Kat Stein, the director, and Caitlin Dotson, and Skip Hewlett, and Chuck Barber. If you all could stand up and let us thank you for your work. And of course, Chantel Dunham with our development. And we're grateful to filmmaker Jim Black and Dan Aguiar, who have helped us with all of the work with the videography, which I think has added a tremendous amount to our program. And I want to mention that we're pleased that the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame events this weekend are part of the University of Georgia Arts Council's Spotlight on the Arts Festival, which continues through November 17th, and the full schedule, which has more than 100 events and exhibits, is available online if you want to search that. So I want to thank all of you for coming, and let's give one more round of applause for Alicia Stallings, for Jhansi Edge, and to the memory of Julia Collier Harris.